Shocking.
We just had a busy week, and I was running around California. One of my friends was about to come to me, and then it was over.
So we're going to go ahead and get started here. You want this?
It'd be good to close that. Yes.
Is that good? So I'm really happy to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Ruth VanDyke. She's an archaeologist who's come down from the University of Binghamton, and she specializes in the archaeology of the American Southwest, landscape archaeology, and much of her research has involved the outlying settlement of Chaco Canyon. And today she is going to speak about some of her work on pilgrimage and the materiality of pilgrimage. And she's also got a lot of other projects that we've been talking about lately, and I'm sure in the question and answer we can talk about some of those as well. But I'd like you all to welcome Dr. Ruth VanDyke. And
Thank you all so much for having me. Is this okay? Okay, good. Yeah, I really appreciate it. It's been absolutely wonderful to drive south only 3 hours and find the sun, which I haven't seen in months and months. It's like this all the time here, right? This is your weather all winter. So it's a pleasure to get to speak with you today, and I have to warn you that you're all guinea pigs. I do work in the ancient Southwest, and I do work on Chaco Canyon. But what I'm going to talk to you about today, it is focused on that to some extent, but it's also somewhat of a new, not entirely new, but kind of a slightly new direction that my current research has taken. And so it's the first time I've plowed through all of this in this kind of format, and I want to kind of see how it works. So I'll be really interested to get your suggestions, feedback, questions, etc. when I'm done. What I'm going to attempt to do for you is weave together all of these different strands here. The anthropological study of pilgrimage, some insights that I have from approaching this from a phenomenological direction, a focus on Chaco Canyon itself as potentially a pilgrimage center and what we might learn or not learn about Chaco by characterizing it as such. And then a focus on the actual journey, the actual traveling part of pilgrimage, and an attempt to, again, weave together an anthropological approach with an archaeological approach and come up with perhaps some new insights or some novel ways to approach what happened in Chaco Canyon 1,000 years ago. Pilgrimage. It's all over the world. Every time period, every place you can go. As I started to work on this, I started to read really broadly, cross-culturally, and if there's a place in the world that doesn't have some semblance of something like this, I have yet to find it. There's a tremendous breadth and depth of literature out there, as I'm sure many of you are all quite aware of. There's also a vibrant tradition, or many traditions, of pilgrimage in indigenous North America, South America, and in the indigenous Southwest, where I work, where peoples in ancient times depicted rows of individuals walking towards some center place. Let's see, you see here? I think it. Some central gathering place, presumably represented by the circle here, and then you've got these rows and rows and rows of people carrying objects and burdens and staffs, and these deer are actually later, but they also seem to be walking towards the circle. This is a rock art panel in southeast Utah that's about 2,000 years old. This is the Zuni Salt Lake, a place where Zuni groups go for various kinds of initiations today and in ethnohistoric times, and where Zuni people also go to gather salt. And this is Mount Taylor, which is a major, very prominent volcanic peak in northwest New Mexico. That's a site where Acoma and Zuni and Navajo and Eastern Pueblo groups all go for various reasons at various times to leave offerings, to say prayers, to gather raw materials for ceremonies. They go in large groups and small. There's a variety of different kinds of compositions that these travels can take. Looking at the pilgrimage literature again, in a broad kind of anthropological perspective, this starts back with the Turners, who of course we're talking about liminality and communitas, and has progressed through contemporary authors like Jill Dubish, who's talking about fieldwork in anthropology as a kind of pilgrimage. There's a tremendous amount of difference, obviously, in what's glossed as pilgrimage, but in every instance, what one seems to be dealing with is some kind of a journey, some kind of a traveling away from the place where you normally live and work, or you usually live and work and spend your life, but you're traveling somewhere else. And so somewhere else, you're going to some place. Pilgrimage always seems to be very grounded in some other place. And you want to go to that particular place for some reason that, again, there's a wide variety of them. It could be something glossed as spiritual, or it could be something that you are emotionally resonating to in some way, or it could be to be healed, or it could be to obtain something, but there's some reason to go to that specific place. When you start, again, looking broadly cross-culturally, you start seeing that actually this can be pretty useful, this kind of comparative approach, because you start being aware of all the ways in which pilgrimage is not only similar, but is also different around the world. And here I'm not going to exhaustively go through the details of this list, but if one were to, for instance, look at medieval Christian pilgrimage to places like the Holy Land, or Rome, or Santiago de Compostela, you find this general, it's not really an attribute list, but these general characteristics that could be used to describe that pilgrimage. And if you contrast that with, say, the Muslim Hajj, you find that on every count, there's a lot of differences here. Muslim Hajj is actually obligatory, and it's very restricted in terms of who can go, and what you wear, and what you do when you get there, etc., in ways that it was not for medieval Christians. So while in general in my work, I think I tend to be much more of kind of a particularist. I like to work within my own space. For this project, I realized I really need to be thinking about cross-culturally, looking around the world, how do people participate in pilgrimage, and what similarities and differences are there, and how might I then take that back to Chaco. Back to the similarities side. When people travel to a particular place, they tend to choose those places for reasons that are complicated but have to do with specialness in some constructive sense. And the Turners talk about this a little bit, and everybody else who's talked about pilgrimage has talked about the places where people go and has tried to unpack why these particular spots. The notion of an axis mundi, which goes back to Mircea Eliade, is a really powerful kind of trope that one sees or reads about being mentioned again and again. A place that has some sort of topographic difference to it, that's kind of a breach between worlds, or an axis or center place where one could potentially traverse upper places and lower places, or afterworlds and present worlds, or different layers of a cosmology. And often on the landscape, such places are represented in the imagination by oddly shaped mountain peaks, or by watery spots like springs or lakes around the world. And not everyone does, but a lot of folks talk about an axis mundi type of place as a place where one might go on a pilgrimage. Another piece of this has to do with places that are very resonant because they have some connotation with people who were in this place before. And I mean, the most obvious example would be a burial complex or burial monument or tomb. But you also have archaeological sites, or simply storied places, places where things happened in the past. And those kinds of places can be a draw for pilgrims, for visitors who are undertaking this kind of a journey to a particularly resonant spot. And then miraculous events and apparitions. This was a focus particularly of the Turners, who were working primarily with Christian and Marian pilgrimages, and talking about how places often become the foci of pilgrimage because there's a story about, say, the Virgin Mary has appeared to a shepherd and given the shepherd a certain amount of instructions, and the shepherd at first doesn't believe, and so then the Virgin Mary has to undertake some or cause some miracles to happen to get the shepherd to believe. And the upshot of all of this is, here's a place where one can connect with the divine, connect with the supernatural. These aren't mutually exclusive, and in fact, I'm showing you the example there of Le Puy-en-Velay because it's a place where you have all three. You can certainly have all of these things happening in the same space, and sometimes they are overlaying on top of one another, as is also the case at Le Puy-en-Velay, where today this is more of a Catholic kind of a place to go, but it's also got a very deep history, and originally was a locus, there's reputedly a Celtic shrine on top of one of these odd rock formations that apparently is topographically very distinct and at one point might have functioned as a kind of access node. So the places themselves are of a lot of interest. And when people go to these places, all of these places, for all of these reasons, seem to be places where people are trying to break through the materiality or the mundanity of daily life and connect with something else. And here, I think I'm influenced from reading Latour and reading some of the other folks who are participating in the so-called ontological turn at present. I actually just reread We Have Never Been Modern last week because I'm teaching it in the seminars. I'm thinking a lot about purification today. But it makes a lot of sense to me that when people go to pilgrimage, and here I'm again, writ very large, or glossing this very generally, people who go on pilgrimage to a particular place, it seems like what they're trying to do is not only step outside of their daily lives, but also step outside of their normal reality and connect with some other kind of reality in a way that, for me, kind of suggests we don't want to purify, we've never purified, right? We want to break through that. We want to be integrating the material and the familiar with something perhaps divine or unfamiliar or spiritual in some sense. So some of the many kinds of boundaries that I think people try to breach through this process involve boundaries of time. They might involve boundaries of space. They might involve boundaries of animacy. They might involve boundaries of life or death. Again, there are many different kinds of dimensions that such breaching of boundaries could take. As people try to breach these boundaries, it's their bodies and materials that often seem to be brought into contact. And here are just a few examples. Muslims in Mecca circulating around the Kaaba, which has this black stone set as its foundation, which has a very old history in and of itself. And the point is to circulate and also to touch, if you can get close enough. This stone, when you touch the stone, that's the moment in which you're actually connecting with Muhammad or the past or all of those layers of ritual and belief or whatever it is. The lower right there, touching a particular statue in the cathedral at Santiago de Compostela. There's a long tradition of pilgrimages, Christian pilgrims who arrive there, touching the statue and a whole sequence of beliefs around this, but the idea of actually touching it, having your hand in contact with the stone, seems to be what's important. And then upper right, holy water. Water frequently is a medium for this kind of transcendent breakthrough from the mundane to the divine, if you want to think about it that way. And that sounds very structural, and I don't necessarily mean it to, but this kind of cross-pollinating of realms that otherwise might seem to be separate or purified. The other piece of this that I think is really important is that it's not just the places that people go on pilgrimage, but it's the pilgrimage itself that's critical. And most of the anthropology that I've read that's dealt with pilgrimage, it's dealt with the places. People are interested in going to the place where the pilgrims have gone and try to figure out what's gone on there and what that's meant to them in all of its many glorious forms, as I've just been briefly and very generally talking about. But pilgrimage also involves moving the body from where you are now to this place that you want to go to have this transcendent or breakthrough kind of experience. And as such, then it involves, or it could be useful to think about this from a phenomenological approach. You actually are, in many times in places, walking when you're going on a pilgrimage. Your feet are in contact with the earth, and you're moving very, very slowly. And here I'm invoking the work of Rebecca Solnit, who's a journalist, actually, who writes about travel, and she writes about walking, and she writes about cities, among other things. She's very heavily influenced, actually, by phenomenologists, and points out that when one is walking, you experience the world completely differently than when we, as most of us generally do, hop into cars or streetcars or airplanes or whatever, or even bicycles. When one is walking, you're forced to confront the minutiae of the world around you and think about it in ways that otherwise you're not. So in the past, or today, when people undertake pilgrimage and they're walking, they're also immersing their bodies in what might be a pretty unfamiliar kind of experience that forces you to slow down and gets you to really engage with the world around you and be very aware of your body and also about the place that you're passing through. I've also been influenced a lot by Tim Ingold, who, among many wonderful things that he's written, I'm rather taken at the moment by his book Lines, in which he discusses the difference between, what does he call it, traveling for the sake of getting from point A to point B versus wayfaring. And most travel, say, in the so-called modern world, we hop in the car, we hop in the plane, and the whole goal is to get there, right? It's not the travel itself. Yesterday, I drove down from Binghamton, and the whole point was to get off the bloody turnpike and out of traffic and to get here, right? And we hop in planes, and that's kind of the most extreme example of it. Well, this is drastically different from the notion of traveling as an experience, traveling as wayfaring. Traveling not necessarily without a destination, but the travel itself as part of the reason to go. And again, if you're walking, you're forced to take that into consideration. If you're walking, you are wayfaring at some level. Even if your goal is to get over there to point B, if point B is more than a day's walk away, you're going to become very focused on and you're going to be thinking quite a lot about the walking itself as opposed to the getting there. One example of how this dramatically affects pilgrimage, past and present, in my reading about the Hajj, of course, there was a time when, for many Muslims, to go to Mecca was extremely expensive and it was difficult, and it involved journeys of years and caravans and dangers, and the travel itself was really arriving in Mecca was almost secondary. That was the goal, but it was the travel where people really had all these tremendous experiences and learned a lot. And then you got there, you did your thing, then you turned around and came back. Today, I've read, when a lot of Muslims go to Mecca, you hop on the plane with your organized group, and you get off the plane, and you do your thing, and you get on the plane, and you come back. And there are some Islamic scholars who are saying, wow, we've lost something here. Something about the actual travel part was actually significant and relevant, and tourists or pilgrims today don't tend to engage in that piece of it. They're doing something different. Be that as it may, it's really clear to me that walking is a very different kind of travel than the other sorts of travel that we generally do. And when people went on pilgrimage to Chaco Canyon, of course, they walked. Chaco Canyon, part 2 of the talk. Brief overview for those of you who are unfamiliar, and I could expand on this and could have expanded on this, so I will welcome questions if there are things about Chaco that I don't talk about that you want to know. Southwest United States, northwest New Mexico, very arid landscape today, national park in the middle of the Navajo Reservation, and surrounded by a lot of other very well-preserved archaeology, shall we say. This is a region of the world where people have been farming and living for thousands of years. And between about AD 850 and 1150, the canyon itself was the locus of a lot of very busy activity. The construction of monumental architecture, such as Pueblo Bonito, depicted there on the left, and some of the other great houses in Chaco Canyon, so called because the farmers living in this region were living in buildings called pueblos before this and after this that were essentially apartment houses, multiple stories, with a certain formality to them. But during the height of the Chacoan period, these were huge, and the walls were very thick, and they grew very tall, 3-4 stories high, and many of the rooms are in fact apparently empty, and they seem to have been used for not necessarily just residential purposes. So they're on a scale that is far outside of anything that happens, certainly before. There are large pueblos that happen after that are clearly residential. So they're odd in that respect, which is one of the reasons why, since the days of the Hajj expedition back in the 1880s, they've been regarded as really special and really attractive by archaeologists and tourists and New Agers and artists, etc. And one of the reasons why it's a national monument. And also one of the reasons why it's perplexed generations of archaeologists, and myself included. There is also monumental architecture in the form of great kivas, which are these large circular subterranean or semi-subterranean rooms, also built out of the same kind of monumental architecture, with very formal layouts, very formal floor features, very formal orientations. And they tend to be built out in front of the great houses or across the canyon from the great houses in a very formal sort of way. And these circular rooms, they're about the size of this room, and it's pretty intuitive that people would have gathered there. They may have done a lot of other things there as well, but it's a very intuitive kind of a space to have a gathering of maybe a couple hundred people. In Chaco Canyon, at the same time, there are also several hundred residential sites that are clearly small farmers' houses. So the relationship between all of these small farmers and these larger monumental edifices has long been of great interest to my colleagues and to me. And a whole range of explanatory models have been posited over the years to try to figure out just what is going on in Chaco. The canyon is a place that any visitor can see fits some of the ideas of a spot that would be potentially visited by pilgrims, not just visited by, I suppose, tourist pilgrims today, one could think of it that way. It's a very ancient place. While we tend to focus and be sucked in by the architecture that dates to about 1,000 years ago, there had been very large communities there for hundreds of years before then. And some of those communities are situated in very prominent places with shrines on them, actually, that date from the Chacoan period. So it's clear that the Chacoans cared about these places, were interacting with these places, knew about these places. And Chaco Canyon itself is an extremely dramatic locale topographically. You always think Chaco Canyon, okay, so it's a cut in the earth, but actually what it is an uplift that then has been eroded by the Chaco River, so that there's two canyons that are created, or there's a canyon that's created by two very, very high places on either side. So when you stand up on those high places, you in fact have tremendous visibility throughout the surrounding depression of the San Juan River, the San Juan Basin. And there are little spires that this erosional process left intact, such as Fajada Butte. I don't know if you guys can see, you might be able to watch it out, but you can see pretty well. Here's Fajada Butte, and here's my student Arena standing on an overlook at the edge of Chakra Mesa, one of these mesas. And this is about 500, 600 feet tall, and then there's the valley, and then she's on this peak here. On all of these high places, there are shrines, there are lookouts. It's clear that people cared about what they could see, and in fact, they were very entranced by this. And this is exactly the kind of topography that one might expect would be seen as a place where you could transcend worlds, maybe the sky or the earth below, or that would be kind of a nexus for different kinds of directions or different kinds of ideas. And I have some reasons for thinking that other than I'm just saying it too, which we can get into. We also have a tremendous amount of evidence that there were happenings at Chaco. Also just reread Seth Fowles' wonderful book, Archaeology of Doings. I don't know if you've read it, but you should. I might call these doings as opposed to ritual events now, but things that were integrated into their lives that involve stuff like ducks, and the horned figures, and frogs, and the infamous cylinder vessels that my colleague Patty Crown has recently demonstrated have the signature of cacao being in them at one point, so presumably they're drinking cacao. With rock art and with the buildings themselves, the Chacoans were marking major astronomical events like solstices or like lunar standstills. So there's a lot of good reasons to talk about movements of the sun and moon and animals and practices happening at Chaco that were pretty special. And then, the story isn't complete without thinking about, not only do we have Chaco Canyon here, but we've got something like 100 additional sites that we refer to as outliers that are in the surrounding San Juan Basin, an area about 100 miles or so in radius, so maybe about 200 miles in diameter. And it kind of depends on how you count and what time period you're talking about, so I'll say roughly 100. And these are sites, these are communities that also have the great houses and the great kivas and the small sites They're usually not quite as big as what you might find in Chaco Canyon itself, but they presumably have a relationship to Chaco Canyon. So again, the relationship of these outliers to Chaco and the nature of the whole thing has been fodder for many, many different models. The model that I like the most and that I had adopted and I think would still stand by to some extent in my work in Chaco over the years has been the notion that Chaco is a place where people from these outliers would have gathered periodically to do things that were special, to have their ceremonial events or ritual events, perhaps organized around solstices or equinoxes or harvesting or planting, things like that. And there's a lot of evidence to support the notion of Chaco Canyon as a central place where people did gather. It's an axis mundi. It's a persistent place. The ancestors are there, the topography is there, it's very special and it's very unusual even for that part of the Southwest. The monumental architecture is certainly suitable for lots of people to gather, and it's suitable for things like performance. It seems like there's a lot of evidence for these so-called ritual activities. And we've got material evidence that people are gathering here. They're bringing stuff from a long ways away. I'm particularly interested in the materials that are brought from the Chaco Mountains, which are about 90 kilometers to the west. Wood, pottery, chert, corn. Some of the things, corn, yes, you can eat that. Wood, you can build with that. But some of the things are not so obvious as to why you would cart them over that distance. For example, there's a particular kind of orangey pinkish chert called Narbona Pass chert that people brought from the Chaco Mountains and left in the middens in the piles of refuse. They're not really trash, but the piles of refuse in front of Chaco and great houses. And often these are very large unworked pieces. Well, there's plenty of good lithic material just in and around Chaco Canyon. So what do you want to carry rocks 90 kilometers for and then leave them there? They're very pretty rocks. They're orange and pink rocks. They're very unusual looking rocks. So this all kind of smacks of there's some non-functional reason why you're carrying these rocks. We also know, because we have excellent tree ring dating in the American Southwest, that these buildings were built in big, massive kinds of organized events. And these events also seem to coalesce around times when there were lunar standstills. So whenever a lunar standstill is happening, this might be a time to add on a new wing to a great house, and we can actually see that this is happening looking at the cutting dates of a lot of the timbers that are used in the roof beams. So that suggests a lot of people getting together periodically, because you need a lot of people to put up a great house, and there's a lot of different tasks involved, there's a lot of heavy lifting involved, and there's undoubtedly a lot of different specializations involved, shaping the stone, setting the stone, harvesting the beams, carrying the beams, finishing the beams, designing the houses, quarrying the stone, etc. So you need a lot of people here for this. We also have this region around Chaco Canyon where we see that there's a lot of similar ideas being shared. This monumental architectural style is out there, and we've got the roads. I didn't talk about the roads, but we've got these linear alignments that actually extend out from Chaco Canyon that seem important to this story as well. And then last but not least, we have evidence at one of the great houses where some of my colleagues back in the 1970s excavated one of the large mounds in front of the great house. And stratigraphically, it appeared that what happened was there were layers of animal bone like deer and rabbit and a lot of smashed cooking vessels that were imported by production space from the mountains 90 kilometers away, by the way. And then little hiatus, and then this happens again, little hiatus, this happens again. And there were thousands of vessels, by their estimation, too many vessels to represent simply people living in that site. So this seemed to be very strong evidence of periodic feasting. So all of this evidence taken together, yeah, Chaco's a pilgrimage center, right? That was certainly a stance adopted by Jim Judge, director of the Chaco Project back in the 1970s and 80s, who used this notion of pilgrimage or a pilgrimage center as part of his functional argument for Chaco as a place where people would have gathered to exchange raw materials and exchange corn. And because this is a very arid kind of environment and rainfall isn't predictable. The idea, you can hear the 70s and 80s speak here as I'm talking, the idea was that people to adapt to this environment would have wanted to get together periodically to meet with each other and to exchange, because some years some people would have a lot of corn and some people would have very little corn. So those with a lot of corn would come and give it to the people who had little corn, and then the following year maybe the situation would be reversed, and because of this, in the end, nobody would go hungry any particular year. And as part of this, then you had these ceremonial activities and things that were just kind of like the veneer to this model. Big problem with this model, like there is with a lot of functional models, this is very kind of descriptive, but how did this thing get rolling? What's really going on here? How would people know to gather at Chaco? And how would they get this whole thing organized and off the ground? And the notion of pilgrimage really was just kind of slapped onto this as, okay, well, while they're there, they'll trade with each other, they must be doing some ceremonies, this must be a pilgrimage center. But there was no real unpacking of what that might entail. Then we have Colin Renfrew, who got involved with the Chaco synthesis, which happened a couple decades later, and they were trying to pull together a lot of ideas about Chaco. And Renfrew said, you know, Chaco really looks to me like a location of high devotional expression. So I definitely think it's a pilgrimage center. Okay, but what does that mean? And he based this on the idea, for instance, people bringing those pink pieces of chert from the Chusca Mountains and leaving them on top of the midden. So people came, they left things, but that's kind of as far as that went. Recently, my colleague John Cantner and one of his grad students has talked about pilgrimage to Chaco from outliers as what he's calling costly signaling. The idea that this is a rational decision made by people whose long-term best interest it is to signal to others that they are in fact very invested in their religion. Because if everybody believes you're invested in your religion, then they'll help you out if you need it. Whereas if they don't think you're serious about your religion, then they might not. But you could just say, hey, I'm a believer, and why should people believe you? But if you go on a pilgrimage, then it's costly. Then you've invested something, and they're really going to believe you. I really don't. I love John Cantner. He's a good friend, and I'm glad he's actually thinking about why people would have undertaken the pilgrimage. But that doesn't really ring very true to me, or doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, because it completely leaves out all of the emotional and kind of transcendent, if you will, things that people seem to be doing at these places. And then finally, we have my wonderful colleague Steve Plugg at University of Virginia and his former student Adam Watson, who reanalyzed that stratigraphy and those ceramics from the mound I was telling you about in front of the Great House Palo Alto, and concurred that the statistics of the original analysts were off and that there isn't really that much pottery in the mound, and therefore the evidence for feasting at the mound, in fact, isn't very good, and therefore Chaco had nothing to do with pilgrimage. It was just a big pueblo. Yeah, okay. That actually is one of the things that inspired me to start thinking more deeply about pilgrimage, because it seems to me like feasting is just one thing that happens sometimes in some pilgrimage contexts. And people are often living in places that also are very, very frequently visited by pilgrims. Rome isn't just the Vatican. Rome has a whole city around it. So whether or not there's evidence for feasting at Palo Alto doesn't seem to me to necessarily dictate whether or not pilgrims ever came to Chaco. It seems like there's a relationship there that doesn't really follow. So this is one of the things that got me thinking, well, you know, what's really going on? When people say pilgrimage, what are they really talking about? What about transcending those boundaries? What about those haptic interactions that people are having with materials? What about the journey itself? How am I going to approach those things? It's going to be difficult. One thing I might want to do as a person with a phenomenological bent would be to undertake a pilgrimage. But I can't really undertake a pilgrimage to Chaco in the same way as people did in the past for all kinds of reasons. One being permission to land status, but perhaps another more serious problem being that people in the past, when they undertook a pilgrimage to Chaco, they were going in a large group, presumably. They were probably going by themselves, and there was a whole kind of social dimension to it that I'm not going to be able to create if it's me and a couple of colleagues and our backpacks in the San Juan Basin. So better to do some other kind of pilgrimage. Now, I don't want to overdraw the comparison of what follows. I'm not suggesting that a pilgrimage undertaken in the contemporary world with contemporary people to a place for completely other, different Western reasons on the other side of the world is necessarily some kind of a roadmap through which to understand Chaco. But it did seem to me that going through the process might provide me with some clues as to things to think about Chaco that are hitherto unexplored. So here's what we did. We walked 1,000 kilometers from Seville to Santiago de Compostela. And this is one of several contemporary pilgrimage routes that ends up in Santiago de Compostela. It follows a medieval route that's been in play off and on for about 1,000 years, so it's got these deep Christian medieval roots to it. Today, a lot of people who undertake the pilgrimage do so because they're good Catholics, but a lot of people undertake the pilgrimage because they want to walk across Spain and see what this is like and try to have that experience. So some of the things that one learns in undertaking a quest like this, you're following a route, and in fact, here just to kind of start off, you're walking on foot. We walked on foot for 1,000 kilometers. People would have walked on foot for probably not 1,000 kilometers, but more like 200 kilometers or so to Chaco in the past. Sometimes there are linear alignments or roads that you can follow. Sometimes there are trails. Because you're walking, you start thinking very critically about weight and what you're going to carry. I was thinking about that just this morning. I have this backpack that all my stuff is in, and Whit said, you can leave that in the office, but I didn't want to because I knew the minute I did I was going to need my cell phone or receipts or something. But I'm carrying it, and we're walking around the museum, and I'm thinking, these things get like heavy. And it's probably only, I don't know, 5-6 pounds. So if you're going to carry everything with you and you're walking 200 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers, you start thinking really seriously about what that is going to be. What do you actually need? In medieval times, when pilgrims would walk to Santiago de Compostela, you were actually, as part of the Christian kind of penance of it, you were not supposed to carry anything except maybe a gourd full of water and a loaf of bread. You were supposed to depend entirely on the largesse of the people that you met along the way or of various monasteries and places like that you might stop. When we walked to Santiago de Compostela, we had a little bit more gear. We had high-tech backpacks and water bottles and power bars and what have you, but still, the weight was really a concern. If you're walking to Chaco, we know things are moving around. We know corn is moving around. We know pots are moving around. We know those rocks are moving around. We have devoted virtually no energy in terms of thinking about how objects were carried. We know that there are burden baskets like the ones depicted here that are found sometimes in dry caves. There's rock art depictions of people carrying things. But how much can you actually carry? How much would you want to carry? What would you carry in? These are dimensions that at present are not really very well explored. Foot gear. You're walking 200 kilometers or more, and you become obsessed with your feet. Thinking back about Tim Ingold and Rebecca Solnit, The World at 3 miles an hour. After you've walked 20 kilometers in a day, yeah, your feet are tired. Second day, your feet are more tired. Fifth, sixth day, maybe your feet are getting used to it. But still, this is a hard thing to do to your feet. And high-tech hiking boots on the modern pilgrimage. In the past, first of all, people would have been more used to walking. They would have been walking most of the time, all of the time. But they did have a wide range of different kinds of footgear, and we do know quite a lot about ancient Pueblo footgear. We have examples of sandals, again, found in dry caves. We have depictions of sandals on rock art. We actually know from rock art in Chaco Canyon that polydactyly seem to have been a thing. There are a lot of six-toed figures in rock art in Chaco Canyon. There have been some six-toed sandals found, but nobody, again, has really addressed this. When we look at sandals, we tend to be really focused on how were they made, and that's fine. But how were they used? Could we actually see evidence of wear on sandals and be able to say, yeah, this looks like your long-distance trekking sandal versus your ceremonial sandal or your everyday house slipper sandal? I don't think anybody's really thought about sandals that way. How do you figure out where you're going to go? Someone asked me this at dinner last night. How did they know which direction to go? Well, we were following a Roman road which was marked by Roman malarios. And in fact, in contemporary times, the Camino is marked by yellow arrows and road signs, but the Chacoans do have cairns and shrines and these horseshoe-shaped rock formation or rock features called herodors or horseshoes that are on high places and often associated with road segments. It's pretty clear that during the time that you had, say, 100 outliers in the San Juan Basin surrounding Chaco, people knew about each other and they were walking back and forth amongst the settlements, of course they were. And there were undoubtedly trails, but there were also undoubtedly formal routes here and there. And maybe you went a certain way because of the topography, or maybe you went a certain way to avoid some group that you wanted to avoid. But there undoubtedly were routes and are routes that in some cases we can find and can reconstruct. Rock art is also part of this, and rock art is really understudied in the Chacoan world. So that's another thing that we should be looking at to try to understand how people were moving across the landscape. There are places where people carry things and leave things, and these don't, sometimes they're functional things like your boots wear out and you leave your boots, but more often there's actually a tradition on the Camino of people carrying particular kinds of rocks and leaving them at certain places. And the modern story version of this is, well, take a rock from some place that represents some weight that you want to discard in some spiritual way when you're on the Camino, and then when you get to the appropriate spot or when you get to an appropriate shrine, you leave the rock and you're symbolically leaving that weight behind. Well, be that as it may, there's certainly lots of evidence of deposition of things on these high places and on shrines in Chaco and on the way to Chaco. Things like turquoise, for example, frequently found on shrines on high places on the way to Chaco. Where are you going to stay? Camino de Santiago, we stayed in albergues. On the way to Chaco, there are outlier communities actually along the Chaco River about every 5 kilometers. And we have yet to really identify a road along this stretch, but there's site after site after site after site. And this is the region where I was telling some of you last night, I'm working in collaboration with some of my Navajo colleagues to actually map and understand these settlements. They're pretty much unexplored because they're in a really remote area of the Navajo reservation, and they are the settlements that are between Chaco Canyon and the Chusco Mountains. So we know that people were walking back and forth this way all the time, or a lot of the time. We know that because we see the materials moving. So trying to understand where the trails are, where the shrines are, what the landscape looks like in between is really key. And that's what I've just started working on, and I'll probably be working on for the next, I don't know how long, 5, 10 years, however long it takes to do this. It's also imperative that we do this now, by the way, because oil and gas interests have moved into the San Juan Basin and want to carve up this landscape into a series of frac pads. So whether or not one draws a little circle around an outlier great house and prohibits fracking from taking place on that space, the landscape itself will be utterly destroyed by this process. So we're trying to get out there ahead of that and do it now. And there's also the people along the way, because you're not walking by yourself on the Camino de Santiago. You meet people, you fall in with people, you fall out with people, you bond with people, and you certainly have a sense that you are in somewhat of a liminal space. The Turners have been really criticized for liminality in communitas and anti-structure, with the point being made by their critics that all of those things don't always happen on every pilgrimage, and fair enough, but they do happen a lot of the time. And certainly when you're walking every day, it's the walk itself that becomes really the focus of your life, not where you came from and not where you're going. So you really are in some kind of alternative, kind of liminal reality. And you are, again, bonding with the people that you're walking with. And for the Turners, this was all about breakdown of traditional social hierarchy, and so the wealthy person walking next to the peasant while you're all on the pilgrimage together. I don't know how far we want to push that, and I don't know how we potentially translate that into pilgrimage to Chaco, but it was clear walking to Santiago that there was a lot of that going on. What's holding you together is the fact that you're all on the pilgrimage, and that's what's important in that moment, in that time, and in that place. You have to go through things that are potentially very adverse. In medieval times, there were robbers, and this is a depiction from a medieval book, actually, about a medieval guide to the Santiago de Compostela that shows some Hapless pilgrim being beset upon by robbers. When we walked, we had to primarily worry about the big trucks and the trains, and occasionally the planes, as we actually walked across an active airstrip one time. We were following the yellow arrows where they led us. Chacoans had to worry about things too. There are water dangers, plant dangers, animal dangers, maybe other people dangers. And when you leave your community and you're out in that liminal space, bad things can happen. Finally, you're getting close to your destination, and as the Turners argued, as you get close to Santiago de Compostela, there's very, very large monuments, everything becomes very, very formal. Same thing happens when you get close to Chaco. When you get into Santiago, what do? You go through a number of, if you're going to do the pilgrimage right, you go through a number of kind of procedures where you go in the cathedral and you hug the statue of the saint and you visit the saint's tomb and you touch that particular column with the statue. And then you stand in a very, very long line so that you can receive from the Catholic Church your formal Compostela, your certificate that indicates that, yes, I did the pilgrimage. And this is all part of an overlay of institutionalization that's happened over the years as the Catholic Church has basically taken or attempted to take ownership of not just people walking to Santiago, but all the various other economic and political things that entails. What's happening in Chaco? Similarly, a lot of formalization. And these are things that I wrote about in the Chaco experience, but the canyon itself, the monumental architecture really inscribes this place as the center, because it's the place where opposites meet, where the upper world and the lower world meets, where great kivas meet great houses, one going up into the sky, one going down into the ground. It's the place where north and south directions meet, as inscribed on the landscape by a north and a south road. It's the place where time actually meets the ancestors, meet the present. It's the place where the sun revolves around and the moon revolves around. When the Chacoans marked the solstices and when they marked the lunar standstills, from that place, observing it in that moment, it would appear that, in fact, Chaco's the center of the earth, and the sun is actually orienting or revolving around Chaco. So there are all these ways in which the Chacoans used the architecture and used the landscape to convey this very, very formal notion that they are at the center, that they are at the place where you break through, transcend the boundaries, do whatever you're going to do. This is another illustration of the formalization of the Chaco landscape, showing a north-south alignment. The book, Shameless Plug. Okay. So Chaco itself is a place where then you're transcending the boundary and you're doing it through all of these material ways, but there also would have been all of these sensory kinds of experiences involved in that. So what I'm trying to do now is draw all of these things together and craft the understandings that I gleaned from walking on the Camino into some sort of larger project in which I can explore things like the sandals and the shrines and the roads and the landscape across between Chaco and the Chisques, and really think about what it would have been like to journey to Chaco, not just to be at Chaco, and not just think about Chaco as, oh, it's a pilgrimage center, you know, game over, but rather, what does it mean to say Chaco is a pilgrimage center? Now, if I had time, I promised that I would show you a little experimental film that is an example of one of these haptic experiences, and it looks like I do have time, so let me see if I can get it to work. We'll come back to the thank you slide. This is online, so if my internet access actually works, this might, nope, uh-oh. I don't know. We tried to set it up. I don't know if we'll get it or not.
You can take a minute to go on.
Yeah? Okay, we'll give it a minute. I'll give it a minute because it's worth it if it works.
Oh, maybe too long. Turn it off and turn it on again. Yeah.
Okay.
Right there.
You know what? I can channel it through my hotspot. Give me a minute. Technology. How do we live without these things? I don't know.
Do you want one of us to just sign you into
Somebody did actually, and it didn't.
No, you can sign
but we can send you onto the classroom.
Oh, okay. Well, here, I think that's how it's going to work. So.
Well, if you're on now, go and try it now.
Yeah, I just connected by the hotspot. So. Okay. Okay. So this is actually this is unpublished thus far, but it should be coming out any day now. It's a homepage for a book that I did with University Press of Colorado called Subjects and Narratives in Archaeology. And it's a hybrid book that has a web component to it as well as the hard copy as well as an ebook version. And what we were trying to do was really play with different kinds of ways of representing the past and representing archaeology. So we have playwrights in here, we have artists in here, we have short stories in here, etc. And one of the things that I did was this. This is what I want to show you. And I hope there's going to be sound, because if there isn't. Yeah. At Chaco, the last slide is just says thank you, so I'll just leave it there. So at Chaco, the spadefoot toads come out when it rains, and they make this really, really loud noise, which one of my ranger friends actually is very taken with it, and he taped for me. And it seemed to me there was some synergy between that sound and the sound of corn grinding, which is something that happens in the Pueblo world that women do, and that happens in association with ceremonies, and there's a lot of corn grinding bins in and around the Chaco and great houses, so clearly corn grinding was a big deal there. And there are a number of Pueblo ceremonies that are around corn grinding, one of which involves these hemi-monocachinas that you saw at the end. These are actually men dressed up as female kachinas who use a sheep scapula as a raft to imitate women grinding by making that same sound. So I was thinking all of these things just acoustically go together, and I was trying to kind of play with that idea when I made this little clip, and I showed it to a friend of mine who was Hopi, and I said, what do you think? And he said, well, did you know that in fact on the end of those sheep scapula they have little frogs carved? So apparently, I was onto something there. My point in showing this to you is that here's an example of a way that maybe we could start to try to explore the haptic sensibilities that people would have had. Because when you get into Chaco, if it's raining, you're going to hear that sound, and it's deafening. Most days you don't hear it at all, but if it's raining, if it's wet, if it's watery, and remember the significance of water, this is going to be the soundtrack to your experience. So, thank you. I'll stop there. Okay, I'll be delighted to entertain questions in whatever direction you want to take this. Yes?
Hi, thank you so much. I have a two-part question. So first, are the people that are actually building these monumental spaces the same people that are also engaging with traveling and sort of pilgrimage journey? And I'm asking this because what struck me was the ways in which you described the experience of traveling and wayfaring, sort of the weight and the dangers, the heaviness and the physical exhaustion, seem to potentially mirror these parallel experiences of building monumental structures. And because you did talk about these monumental construction events, and so I was wondering if you could further elaborate on the relationship between building and actually traveling, and sort of their social and or commemorative, I guess, domain.
Oh, great question. Yes. One idea that makes some sense to me about how the great houses were constructed, maybe I should back up a step. There isn't there isn't a lot of good archaeological evidence for thousands and thousands of people to have lived in Chaco Canyon, but we have done a lot of labor estimates on the building, and we know how many person hours. Of course, there's a lot of variables involved when you try to calculate labor, but we know that it's highly likely that there would have needed to be people from outside helping with this, or it wouldn't have been possible for, given the evidence that we have for people in the canyon. And today, Pueblo people frequently go on pilgrimages, and they call pilgrimages, to places like Zuni Salt Lake or to certain rock art panels as part of an initiation. Maybe it's an initiation into a certain society, maybe it's like at puberty, there's various reasons for this. So one idea is that a journey to Chaco would be maybe something that you would do as part of an initiation, and you would do it in association with the rest of your cohort, whoever that was, whether it was young men or whether it was people from a particular society or whatever, young women. And you're right, the walking is part of it, and then when you get to Chaco Canyon, then the other part of it is the labor. And so then you contribute your labor to put up the west wing of Pueblo Bonito or whatever it is. And the tree rings tell us that these construction events happen with this kind of real periodicity. So that would support the notion that people are gathering and then going away and then gathering and then going away. But I like your allusion to traveling as a form of labor and traveling as potentially part of the work that is then done to put up the great houses themselves. Thank you. Yes?
Really cool talk. Thank you so much. I wanted to just follow up a little bit on your use of Victor Turner, the idea of liminality and anti-structure. As I'm sure you know, that grows out of Arnold van Gennep's work on rites of passage, and ultimately these ideas go back to Durkheim and the notion of collectivity. So I guess I'm trying to find extra ways of bringing empirical evidence to support your thesis. And so I'm wondering what you can tell us about the archaeology of the region in terms of evidence that we are actually building a larger regional community here in the absence or presence of warfare or not, and relationship then to other surrounding areas.
Okay, excellent question, thank you. Yes, interestingly, I have to talk about a similar sort of thing for a lecture tomorrow, so I'm just contemplating, should I pull up those slides? But I don't think I will. Before this, several hundred years before this, people are living in pretty dispersed farming communities. And then about 200 years before this, there is a period of, we term it aggregation, but it seems like there are a lot of social experiments going on where people would get together, and rather than living in a dispersed community or dispersed communities of maybe like 30, 40 people, they're living in groups of maybe like 300, 400. But that doesn't last very long, and these larger pueblos seem to end badly. There's an extreme processing event at one of them where there's like 53 individuals that are fragmented, their bones are ground up on manos and metates. There's a large structure that apparently was used for community gatherings but then is burned to the ground, and there's people laid out on the floor, and those big pueblos break apart. It seems like it's those people, or perhaps the next generation, the descendants of those people, who come down into the San Juan Basin and who are settling Chaco, but they don't do it, they don't just come together in one central place, but rather they're dispersed over the whole San Juan Basin. And then it's out of a couple hundred-year process of continuing to interact with one another back and forth, I think, that Chaco emerges as the center place, as the place that everybody wants to gather periodically. Part of what I think is going on is that everybody, I won't say everybody, I'm just really generalizing here, but people still want to interact with one another, need one another, perhaps because people have different kinds of, say, ceremonial knowledge or different kinds of pieces of information or resources that they would like to continue to exchange and share and whatnot, but they don't want to live cheek to jowl. They don't want to live next to each other. So they can certainly see a sense in coming together periodically, but then spreading back apart. All the while, still they're sedentary farmers at this point.
But they don't want to live together, but they don't want to fight each other either. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and the evidence that we have for violence in this part of the Southwest predates Chaco and postdates Chaco. And the evidence before Chaco and the evidence post-dating Chaco both are pretty extreme, actually. So there's this idea that during the Chaco time, whatever is going on here, it's kind of glue that's preventing that. And my portrayal of it is all very, some of my colleagues say, oh, touchy-feely, this is the communitas and the solidarity. Another portrayal of this that some of my colleagues prefer is the notion that they did this by force, they did this by coercion, and people were not fighting one another because, by God, you didn't dare, or else the Chaco warlords would come in and kill you. In the absence of evidence of violence during this period, it's harder to make a case for that.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so in Chaco itself, there are a number of great houses.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them are very close together. They're roughly contemporary. So my question is about what's the dynamic between all these different great houses? I mean, were they pretty much functionally the same? Could they have been related to lineages? And what exactly do you think about that?
So it changed over time, and initially there were 3 that I think initially were these new farming communities because they're each founded at the mouths of tributary drainages to Chaco Canyon where the farmland is great. But then over time, as Chaco emerges and becomes this central gathering place, I think that there's a sociopolitical hierarchy that's present across the whole region that's centered in Chaco, and I think within the canyon itself, too, you potentially have some great houses that are greater than others. But there are 2 central ones that are really, really large and elaborate, Pueblo Bonito and Techo Kettle, and then there are others that are perhaps less so, that are up and down the canyon. One idea here is that perhaps different great houses in the canyon are connected to different regions or different outliers, and so different people come to those particular great houses for the ceremonies or the gatherings or what have you. But we're hampered a little bit because I didn't personally, I wish I had, my archaeological forebears excavated in Pueblo Bonito, they've excavated in Pueblo Alto, they've excavated in Techo Kettle, but most of these great houses are in fact unexcavated, and we don't really know. To say Pueblo Bonito is one of a kind, well, what's really in Hungopavi? We really don't know. And we're not going to know anytime soon because the park has a very strong preservationist kind of an ethos right now for good reason. And also, as I was explaining to some folks last night, because it's a very touchy time to be potentially disturbing any Native American burials, so we simply leave them alone. And fortunately, there's a lot that we can learn from looking at the surface, but we can't learn things like, are there other burials of people that look like elites under a wooden floor in Hungopavi, because we can't go look. So hopefully that answers your question. Yes?
Going back to part 1 of the talk and the sort of comparative pilgrimage.
Yeah.
As I was thinking, you didn't actually say it, but distance really is not relevant. What's relevant more is time. So in other words, if you have a plane and it takes you 12 hours, that could be a pretty grueling trip. Whereas 12 hours of walking also is a grueling trip.
Yes.
So is it in pilgrimage studies, is it an issue of how like what makes something, oh, I'm going to go hang my little piece of cloth, they do this in Central Asia, hang my little piece of cloth on a nearby tree because it's a special holy tree and it's a 2-minute walk from your house. That's not a pilgrimage, but it's a special place.
Yeah.
So does it place a pilgrimage, and the people who are living in the place, like the Romans or people in Jerusalem, they already live there, so they can't go on a pilgrimage there. Anyway, so could you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, these are really good points. And so, again, all pilgrimages are not the same, and it seems like in some situations the notion of connecting with whatever it is you're trying to connect with is the most important part. So yeah, go tie your strip of cloth on the tree, and there's a sense in which maybe you're doing the same thing as you would be doing if you went to Mecca, but it's not Mecca.
And you don't call it a pilgrimage either.
Some people have, actually.
Really?
And what I guess I'm trying to get at is that they're similar in the sense that in both cases you're trying to make that connection, right?
Yeah.
But you wouldn't have the added portion of it which involves the hardship and the time investment, the duress, the danger potentially of the traveling. So I'm trying to recall, I'm really just getting into this literature, which is why I'm looking for help. But reading about, again, the Hajj and Islamic pilgrimages kind of over time, it seems like there's a sense in which I read some ethnography about some Turkish villages where you can do local things, but it's better if you can go on the Hajj. So most people are only going to do local things, but if you can get together the resources and go on the Hajj, then that gives you socially, when you come back, to kind of an extra layer of prestige. So I imagine in the Chacoan world, you have these outliers that also have great houses and shrines and things around that. And I imagine there's probably kind of a nested thing going on there where people potentially are visiting some of those, and that's also important, but maybe important in a different way than going to Chaco would be. And probably not everybody gets to go to Chaco, because it is pretty far. It would require, yeah, the time. Thank you. Let's see, so many hands. I go to the back. Yes.
Thank you. My question is about the short film that you showed. Last week we had a conference here on performative visual ethnography, and that incorporates part of that is producing film. And usually it's cultural anthropologists who sort of have to lead the way in the production of film as a scholarly medium. And so I was wondering why you decided to produce this, and what were sort of the ideas behind it? Because usually, because I'm sort of surprised in a good way that an archaeologist, I'm only with an anthropologist, and we also don't really do a lot of film, so I'm excited about this.
Thank you. Let's use the word produced really loosely, because I made this an iMovie and I don't really have the technical skills, and some of the images are blurry, and oh my god. But why did I do it this way? Because I think all of us, whether we want to admit it or not, think really visually, and a lot of the way we understand the world, a lot of the way we interpret the world is actually really visual, and also really, really oral, right? A-U-R-A-L. And when I'm, say, working on a lecture for my undergraduates, there doesn't have to be a PowerPoint with bullet points, but by God, there's got to be pictures, right? There's got to be maps and things. Well, when I started thinking about the toads, I thought, how am I going to explain this to somebody? How can I explain to somebody that I'm hearing some kind of synergy between the sound of the spadefoot's mating when it's raining and the corn grinding and these kachina dances? I could say that, and you can go, yeah, whatever. But I really have to show you, and not even show you, I have to get you to hear it. I'm trying to get you to hear it. So that's why. And that's part of this, the book project that this is part of. There's a lot of archaeologists who are trying to push these kinds of boundaries in different ways. Some of our colleagues think it's great, some of our colleagues think it's total crap and we should cut it out because it's not legitimate scholarship. But I find it sort of playful, but I'm trying to just engage people to think about it, whether or not you agree with my argument. That's why. Yes?
Can you tell us more about Pueblo thoughts about your work?
Okay, good question, thank you. What I didn't go into, and what I do go into in the book it's almost 10 years old now, but the Chaco Experience book, I used a lot of Pueblo ethnography also in my interpretation and understanding of Chaco. And all Pueblo groups, and actually Navajo groups, all indigenous groups on the Colorado Plateau today have stories and oral traditions that relate to Chaco in some sense. So particularly the ideas of directions being really important, and your world, your social world, and your religious world being mapped onto the landscape and vice versa is really, really important in Pueblo thought and in Navajo thought today. And when I have shown this or presented this or discussed this with colleagues at places like Cochiti or Hopi or Navajo, the general response has been pretty favorable, but also cryptic. People say, well, you've got part of it, and another part you don't have, but I can't tell you which part. So in general, it's been pretty favorable. One thing I'd really like to do, and that I'm kind of on the cusp of trying to figure out, is would it be possible to bring Native voices into this whole sort of pilgrimage idea? Because obviously I don't want to compare Chaco to going to Santiago de Compostela. That's useful in terms of thinking through the material dimension of a body walking on a pilgrimage, but there's a lot of relationship between what happened at Chaco and what happens when the Zuni go to Salt Lake. But what the Zuni are doing at Salt Lake is secret Zuni stuff. So I don't know that that is necessarily possible, but it's a conversation I haven't had. So that's kind of where I sit with that right now. Hoping to move in that direction. Yes?
In the historic and ethnographic period, do groups like the Hopi or Laguna or Acoma, do they go to Chaco still?
Oh yeah,
they do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I mean, not something very recent because they read anthropologists, but in the 19th century, things they
Yes, particularly the Acoma. There's actually some there's some ethnographic information from the 1930s, I think, that talks about the Acoma. They're retracing their migration route to Acoma, and first they go to a place that we're not entirely sure where it is, called Black Lake, and then before then they go to Chaco, and it's described in such a way that you can tell it's Chaco, and then before then they go to a place further north, which is probably Mesa Verde or that region. And they were doing this in the 1930s, and there's very specific instructions as to how you plant prayer sticks and how many you plant and the prayers that you say in different places. So yes.
Well, the second part, are there, most Pueblos, or at least now they're Roman Catholic, are there Roman Catholic pilgrimage sites in the Southwest?
Yes, there are. Yes.
Do Pueblo people tend to do that?
Some Pueblo, I mean, to say Pueblo people are, most Pueblo people are Roman Catholic, boy, we have to really seriously unpack that. But certainly Catholicism has seeped its way in and been incorporated into a lot of public practices, particularly on the Rio Grande. And yeah, so insofar as a Pueblo person might also consider themselves to be a Catholic, sure, they might participate in that. There's a really famous pilgrimage site just north of Santa Fe called
Chimayo.
Thank you, Chimayo. Yes, and people actually coming up the week before Easter, Catholics in New Mexico, in that part of New Mexico, will walk there. And some of these are indigenous people that will walk there, and you're supposed to do the last part of it on your knees, and then you're supposed to take earth from Chimayo, and that earth is tremendously potent. A miracle happened there, which is why this particular space is so potent. Sorry?
Hundreds.
A lot of miracles. And the earth is supposed to be healing, but the process itself of going on the pilgrimage is also supposed to be really transformatory. So yes. Yes.
A very, very interesting topic. It's so thought-provoking in so many different ways. And one of the is something that struck me in perhaps it was the first diagram, picture of some of those glasses, and one was with triangles, inverted triangle, and that's where I'm trying to compare the ancient Greek thinking, the ancient Egyptian thinking, and this. So Pythagoras had understood that everything could be explained with triangles, squares, and circles. So triangle comes in there, and in ancient Greek philosophy, that they looked at the nature of the heavens, and mythology was, of course, the forces of nature, and that Thor was a god of thunder, for instance. So Plato had once said, we saw the heavens and the movement of the sun and the moon and the stars, and from that derived the notion of time and developed philosophy which we applied to our lives. So if you look at ancient Egyptian pyramids, they are tetrahedrons, but in elevation they are triangular. And according to Michael Wood, who did one of those documentaries on it, he had said, well, actually, the triangle represented the pharaoh at the top, the community on one side, and the builders on the other. But it had a certain form where the base was on the ground. One would consider that a stable form. Here, the triangles are all inverted.
I'm not sure what you're referring to, actually.
That's the first figure of a picture that's shown of the different objects.
Of the cylindrical vessels.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a really common motif in Pueblo pottery.
Yes, you see, an inverted triangle would be unique in representing the necessity of balance, and they're all inverted triangles. Now that could be reading into it, but do you see some significance of why those triangles are repeated? What do they represent? And
in contemporary Pueblo thought and Kiva murals, triangles represent rain clouds. So rain clouds.
I see.
Yeah.
But
so.
these were all inverted.
If they're inverted on a vessel, obviously that can be moved, right? So I'm needing to look at the image that you're talking about. Oh, I think it's this one. Here, I should plug this back in so everyone can see. Okay, is this what you're talking about?
One on the left, below.
Yeah. The cylinder vessels.
Yes.
Yeah, that's just one of many, many, many motifs that happen on these cylinder vessels. And the notion of having a bounded geometric space that then is filled in with hatched lines, that's really what they're going for here. So I haven't ever noticed that the triangle itself is some particularly overriding motif in public thought. But thank you for your comments. It's very interesting. Yes.
So I know there's been a lot of mapping done of Chaco and the sort of larger structures and the roads and things like that. But in your sort of reframing, especially with your new mapping project of looking at the whole process of pilgrimage, how do you think that will change your methodology on what you choose to map? I know you mentioned the shrines and the Herodotus, but will you sort of significantly change how you look at mapping because you're looking at the overall process versus just looking at the places?
Okay, two thoughts. First of all, maps are such useful tools to us. Of course, we're always looking from the top down and thinking about how to draw things from the top down and entering data into our GISs or flying our drones or whatever. But the Chacoans never saw the world that way. So while I'm a big believer in collating data so that I can look at it from the top down and maybe see some relationship I didn't otherwise see and ask questions like what's the spatial extent of this community or what's the distance from A to B, the Chacoans would have been thinking more in terms of time, right? More in terms of how long did it take to walk from this community to that community, or what are the landforms that I see as I pass in and out of this particular drainage or along this particular route. So I always want to use mapping in combination with phenomenological experience on the ground. And the way you record phenomenological experience is obviously very potentially wide open and subject to critique as well, because it's not in our standard archaeological bag of tricks. But I've been doing things like video camera, walking with a video camera in certain directions where I think there was a trail or towards a certain peak where I think something was important. And as you're walking, you can be talking and thinking about what you're seeing and what's coming into and out of view. That can be very useful. And also doing things like drawing sketches of what you can see, or taking still photographs of what you can see, panoramic photographs of what you can see. I'm on a committee of a doctoral student right now who's working on slave plantation archaeology in Brazil during the historic period, and he's trying to approach this through some of these phenomenological techniques, and he's being really creative, so we'll see what he comes up with. Maybe it'll be a roadmap. But with respect to the mapping, back to the mapping, it is useful to look from the top down, and we want to get a sense of the breadth of what's out there, the variety of things that are out there, and of course what they date to. And LiDAR is something that a lot of my colleagues have been using. Recently, I have been having conversations with folks who are suggesting that that's actually overkill on a kind of really arid landscape where there's really virtually no vegetation, and that we should be directing more of our energy towards drones with cameras and doing things like maybe infrared photography as well as standard photography on some of these features. So I've got a grant proposal in right now with a colleague, and we're trying to start at one end of the Chaco River and basically cover as much as we can with drones. And we'd be going for 100%. I mean, that's probably not realistic, but say to within a couple of miles on either side of the Chacoan corridor there between Chaco Canyon and the Chuscas, try to cover everything. Why? Because if we don't, oil and gas will make it disappear. So, but there's too much out there. This could be 20 more years of this kind of inventory. So we need help. Yes?
So I'm just curious, maybe to go back a little bit to Naomi's question, and go back to the idea of scale. You mentioned in response to her the sort of period just before the Chacoan phenomenon really takes off. And I'm an archaeologist working in the eastern United States, and I feel we talk about Cahokia the same way. Both of them sort of represent sites that are unique in their scale to some degree within their regions, but are sort of preceded by a certain amount of similarity on a smaller scale. And I'm interested in looking at your sort of definition of pilgrimage and our desire within archaeology to define things, like, how do you identify feasting? What are those key characteristics you're looking for? How do you identify pilgrimage? Do you have any ideas of how to identify it on this sort of smaller scale? So, in this maybe basket maker period where you're seeing small central places, aggregation sites that likely have some of these same features of being an axis mundi or being a place where you can connect to memory or to ancestors, but you don't have, 200 kilometers of roads to go off of, and you don't have sort of constructions on the scale of the great houses that dwarf everything around them.
Yeah, I do, although this may not work for you in Cahokia, but in the Southwest, what you can see and prominent topographic peaks on the horizon are really key to Pueblo people today and to Navajo people today, and they certainly were at Chaco, and I think they certainly were for many, many years, for many centuries before this. And so one thing that you can look at is you can look at what's the viewshed of a particular site. What can you see? There are Pueblo I period sites, actually every Pueblo I period site that I know of in north of the San Juan River can see this particular mountain called Sleeping Ute Mountain. So because every site seems to be situated, you know, if you moved it just over a little bit, it wouldn't be able to see it. So because this seems to be important to them, I suspect that that's a place that's a draw, right? There's probably, people were probably going up there and leaving votive offerings or something. I may never find those offerings, and I probably can't prove it, but I can suspect because of those view sheds being maintained the way they were. The other thing, obviously, is just objects moving around or material moving around that are a little bit easier to see, but then, of course, there could be so many reasons for that. But if you have objects like the pink shirt that there's no reason to move it functionally, you know, it's not like the material, it's not different from the material you could get locally, but it's pretty. Or, well, I'm saying it's pretty, but it's a very odd color. It's very unusual looking what's around locally. So that would suggest that there's some other reason for moving it that doesn't have to do with just needing lithic raw material. So those kinds of things that don't fit, right, that seem odd or that seem out of place are probably a good place to start thinking about it. But it's probably going to be really contextual. And when I talk to my colleagues who work at Colloquium, you know, I always want to know, well, what was the view shed? What can you see? And they make the big case to me that, well, there weren't really any trees back then because they cut them all down, so they could in fact see a lot. But modeling that and phenomenologically exploring that, I think, is a whole other set of challenges that I fortunately have. I have my own challenges, but they're not that. Let's see, we're taking next in the back.
Building off of Lucy's question and Bob's question about Navajo people in the present day and their connection to these places, in my time in the Southwest, what I found is that Chaco was regarded as a narrative landscape that is still inhabited, not as an archaeological landscape that's been abandoned.
Yes.
And people do, in fact, still do pilgrimages to Chaco, but they rarely include archaeologists in those pilgrimages. So in the work I did, the research in the early 20th century on people who were first going into the area, what I found is that the most productive archaeologists were those who developed partnerships with local Native people. And it depended upon who chose to partner with you, how that person was positioned in their community, how the community felt about the work you were doing, and that's still very much true today. So you've mentioned that you faced a few challenges, and it's interesting when you say the response you got was favorable but cryptic. That's actually a gatekeeper's response. So how would you develop this project in a way that would serve the interests of contemporary Native communities without violating protocols of secrecy?
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. This is Chaco Canyon is a bit of a flashpoint for contested indigenous ideas about the past because it's in the center of an area that's been occupied by Navajo people for at least 500 years and is part of the Navajo reservation today. And in fact, a lot of the outliers I showed you are on the Navajo reservation. And they're managed jointly by Navajo archaeologists and by the Park Service. But then there's also a very strong relationship between what I've been showing you and contemporary Pueblo people, right? And in an ideal world, that would just be a shared history and there wouldn't be an issue. But in fact, there are some political issues, particularly between the Navajo and the Hopi, that have become very contentious at various times and various points. And one of the I've been working more closely actually with Navajo people, partly because that's where Chaco is, but one of the points that has been made very strongly to me by Navajo archaeologists is that in their own clan histories and their own traditions, people were there back in Chaco times, and Navajo became Navajo at the gathering of the clans, which potentially involved Athabascan speakers moving into the area and joining with a lot of other groups, some of whom were already in the area. So you can't say to a Navajo person today, you have nothing to do with Chaco, because in fact, some Navajo maybe have some very direct things, their ancestors have some very direct things to do with Chaco, and regardless of that, regardless of which Navajo clan you're talking to, they've been living on this landscape for 500 years, and they have a lot of stories and emotion and traditions and things invested in the landscape over the course of that time, and a lot of that involves the archaeology. But the Navajo voices tend to get marginalized in all of this because we have tended to work so closely, we archaeologists in the Southwest have tended to work so closely with very vocal groups like the Hopi, and I have Hopi friends, so this is not meaning to disrespect the Hopi, but I thought, well, I think I'll work with Navajo, partly because I was trying to explain this to some folks last night too. Part of this dispute involves language, and you're probably all familiar with the demise of the term Anasazi. Pueblo people objecting to this and stating that, well, it's a Navajo term and it means ancient enemy, so it's disrespectful. Hopi actually would have archaeologists refer to all the archaeology on the plateau as all the people as Hisatsinome, which means ancestral Hopi. But the archaeologists and the Park Service don't really want to go that route because it's not just about the Hopi. So they've kind of settled on this wishy-washy ancestral Puebloan as a way to try to make everybody happy. But it doesn't make the Navajo contingent happy who see a direct Navajo relationship into the Chaco and past, because they say ancestral Puebloan, but we're not Puebloan, so you're saying these people have no relationship to us. So there's a Navajo faction that actually wants archaeologists to use the word Anasazi as they define it, which simply means other people, not enemies, and it's not pejorative. So I'm in an enviable position as an archaeologist working in this region to not be able to use any label to talk about my people, because if I'm talking about the inhabitants of an outlier community, I have to say inhabitants of the outlier community. The minute I say Anasazi or ancestral Pueblo or Hisatsinome or ancient Chacoans or ancient Puebloans or whatever, I've pissed somebody off, right? So I engage in this digression partly to illustrate to you that archaeology is political, and I can't work in the region without either taking a side or being seen to take a side. So Navajo voices are being marginalized, so I've partnered up with Navajo Nation Archaeological Department and some really wonderful indigenous women archaeologists, and what we're going to do in this program of survey throughout the Western San Juan Basin here involves some Binghamton students, but also some Navajo Nation archaeologists and some Navajo Nation students from Diné College in Shiprock. And we're training those students, and we're not just looking at the Chacoan archaeology, but we're collecting whatever oral histories that the Navajo living on that landscape want to share with us. And that's something that my Navajo colleagues feel very, very strongly about, because a lot of people who had been living in these more remote areas are actually moving closer to the highways and the cities for economic reasons. It's very understandable. But the grandmothers are dying, and that kind of level of stories potentially will be lost. And so they very much want to talk to those grandmothers and find out what they want, whatever they want to tell us about not just the archaeology, but the landscape and their lives in that place and on that place. So that's a component to what we're working on. And your point is absolutely correct, that really one cannot and indeed should not be doing archaeology in North America, or probably a lot of places in the world at present, without partnering up with indigenous communities, because they're there, they have a stake, these are their ancestors, and I'm trying to move towards a situation where I'm more of an enabler for them as opposed to a colonial archaeologist dropping in from the sky and extracting my data and going home. But thank you. Other question? Are we out of time? What?
I think we're just about out of time.
Okay.
Thank you so much.